ahead and get started. Be a short introduction from me. I'm not sure if you all know me, Mike Mofnas. I work with Matt. I'm his peer, or his boss's peer. But in the operations space, the QA team's been working on revamping the test process here at Magento. The last 6 or 7 months, we've been working on simply replacing the current test framework that we have in place today. We know that there was issues with it. It's acceptable issues that we've had today and we've accepted. But there's takeaways that we took from that experience and tried to mold them into a framework now that we feel will be more viable going forward. So I'll turn it over to Alex and Ian to get through the details of that. And there will be other sessions coming up tomorrow that they'll schedule. I don't think they've scheduled it yet, with more hands-on, so you guys get more comfortable with it while we're here.
We scheduled.
You did? Okay, so it's been scheduled. So if you haven't accepted, please check your email. The invites will be in your inbox. So with further ado, I'll introduce Ian Marin from the Austin team, QE team.
Good. Thanks for taking time to attend the presentation, everybody. I'm going to be talking to you guys about the new framework that we've been working on. Just a little background, I'm a software engineer like Alex. I work on the Penguins team, and this is kind of some of the work that has been going on for the past 6-7 months. So it's not completely finished. Obviously, we're going to keep iterating and try to improve it, but I'm just going to show you what we have. So before I do that, I'm going to take a little time to talk about MTF and reflect a little on what that project was like and what the takeaways were that Mike mentioned that kind of helped us form the decision process for the tools that we chose and the kind of core concepts that we constructed MFTF around. So you guys know what MTF is. It's an automation framework that was used for the improvement of the Magento core products. It was to facilitate functional testing. We wanted to use it to minimize efforts of manual regression testing and just kind of expedite the process of confidence and quality as we release code. It was a good project, and a lot of people worked really hard on it. There were some gaps that ended up, I guess, causing a lot of issues, and specifically with adoption throughout the community. So because of that, we kind of took it upon ourselves for the next iteration to look at how we could improve things like reliability, maintainability, the ease of use, performance value, all the things you see listed up there, and that's kind of setting the stage for what we wanted to look at for the replacement. A lot of the issues that people saw were around just creating tests quickly, the technical barrier to creating a new test and kind of determining how to test with the framework was high. And all of these things kind of culminated in us trying to improve quality. Ultimately, we all want to see Magento get released in a way that the users have a smooth process and there's no issue between upgrades and between iterations of bug fixes, things like that. So a lot of those specific uses also culminate in the ways that we see the community using the framework. We'd like to see that in the use of bundled extensions and the ways that people interact with the marketplace and the EQP side of things as well. So those are the things that we kind of had in mind as we were looking at a replacement for MTF, an iteration, if you will. So let's get into specifically what MFTF looks like, what the tools are, what the concepts are, why did we choose specific technologies. So this is the technology stack we chose to work with for MFTF. First three things, there's not a lot of surprises. PHP, Composer, XML, those are things that are core to Magento 2 right now. Those are things we wanted to persist in terms of the framework. It makes sense. People who are already working with Magento know these technologies. I know a lot of you might have already pulled down MFTF and might have seen a lot. There's a heavy interface that you'll have with XML, and a lot of that came from a back and forth with Anton, and that we ourselves had a lot of resistance to it, but he gave us a lot of good reasons. One of which is mergeability, which I'll cover later. But the XML itself is, we know it's a shift in perspective and it's a shift in thinking, but we ask that you just be patient with us and give it a try and iterate as we try to iterate as well and make your experience better. The engine that runs MFTF is based on a tool called Codeception. Codeception is a behavior-driven styled PHP testing framework. So a lot of the functions, a lot of the different types of testing mechanisms you'll see, they'll kind of revolve around this declarative style of functionality, which will make it easier for you to kind of read through a test and understand what it's doing. Allure is the reporting tool we chose. Allure is a very light implementation. It gives you a lot of value in terms of analyzing results and looking into failures, and you'll see that in this presentation as well. And lastly, we chose Robo. That's just a task runner. Makes it easier for you to call commands off the bat. You don't have to remember long command strings. We tried to wrap as many things as we could so that you didn't really have to go back and forth to figure out what you were trying to do. And so we're going to continue to introduce new robo commands for you to use so that that's not a barrier to running very specific types of commands and alterations to the test that you want when you're developing. So, as I mentioned before, these are the core constructs that we kind of focused on. We saw a little bit about what the challenges were between MTF and adoptability, and so these are kind of the things we focused on. Not to say that MTF didn't do all these things well, but these are kind of the things that we took away based on the lessons that were learned from the feedback we got in MTF. So the first thing was traceability. I know our team looks a lot at the MTF bugs that come through, and so a lot of those things stem from just sometimes unclear logging and reporting capabilities. So that's something we emphasized in this particular framework. Maintainability, we wanted to make the test creation very simple, very reusable in structure. Readability, again, we used Codeception because of its clear declarative syntax, and we tried to encapsulate as much of that into our XML declarations. Performance, we wanted to be able to reuse data, reuse pages, reuse sections. You'll see a lot of that in the next couple slides, but we wanted to be able to make it as easy for the developer to look at what was available to them as well as the test execution itself. And finally, customizability. Again, we're choosing XML to kind of serve as the basis for what the test does. A lot of that I know is foreign to most of us, and it's foreign to our team as well. But we've been adapting to it, and we think you'll enjoy it. You'll eventually have a really good experience with it because it really allows you to specify across multiple tests different modifications you'll have to a single test flow and enable those things to run successfully. So let's get into more of the framework. So specifically, the framework itself consists of these components. These are all tags that you'll see in the XML. They're also concepts that you'll see in the Codeception itself. SEST essentially is a file that contains multiple tests. It's called SEST because that's what Codeception named it. That's not the final name. We're gonna try to abstract some of that away, but that's currently the one-to-one relationship we're pairing with the Codeception framework. Tests are tests. They're just groups of actions that essentially allow you to perform some steps, assert on a result, and then move on. We have before and after declarations. Those are for setting up prerequisites, things like data, maybe logging in as an admin before you set up a certain set of steps, things like that. And then after is for tearing down, very, very similar to just what PHP unit does natively. And we also have annotations. Those annotations will serve as metadata reporting tools. Those metadata reporting tools allow us to glean information from the Allure report afterwards. And so what we can do is we can specify these annotations and then see them in the report and kind of understand what pieces of Magento are at risk or what pieces of Magento are tested well and have good coverage. The last couple sections relate to specifically what's used within the test. So we'll have pages, and those are essentially objects that get referenced for information like URL, module, things like that. Those act as variables in a sense. We'll also have sections that get referenced within the page. Those sections live independently from the page, and they can be referenced within any test. The pages act as the outer container, the sections live within that page. We'll also have entities. This is just data essentially that you'd like to specify within a test. Specifying a variable, specifying any sort of reusable information that you'd like to use, and then eventually information that you'd like to persist into Magento. And lastly, we have action groups, and those are reusable sets of actions that you can specify. So if you have a test flow, similarly, like the variation files that you guys are familiar with in MTF, you can actually specify something like that in an action group, but it's a little more like a function would be used in PHP rather than an amalgamation of PHP and XML. So at a high level, this is kind of what a test would be comprised of, and this is definitely a simplification, but you essentially have these big buckets like data and metadata, and there should be one for page, but the slide's kind of small. But essentially within those buckets, you can describe entities, describe different pieces of data and information that are reusable between tests. So at the top level, you can describe a page within an XML file. And within that page, you can specify a URL that's used over 100 tests, over 5 tests, over 1 test, whatever it is that you want. And that information gets reused, and it's specified once, and that way there's a single source of truth for it. Same thing with data. For data, like a customer, you could specify multiple customers with differing data, and you could reuse that within different tests, or you could use the data in conjunction with some metadata that we'll be providing to persist directly into an API. So an example might be if you needed to have a customer ready for you in Magento before you opened up the browser, you could specify something like a create data command and specify the name of a customer that you've declared in data and have that customer available for you before you even open up the browser. So that's something that should help the performance as we're not driving the browser every single time to create these entities. And we've tried to make those as expansive as possible so that you don't have a performance hit every single time you need to create a dependency for your test. So I know this chart's definitely an oversimplification, but we'll look at some code now. So what does this test look like in XML, and how does it run with the PHP Codeception framework? So if you look over here, we essentially have a test within a cest, and the cest, as I said earlier, is the outer shell, that the file essentially that Codeception looks for to contain the information. I know this is kind of a lot, but try to focus more on just the outerlying structures and concepts and not so much as the particular naming or the details. So within that, you have each of the annotations. Those annotations are used later for essentially reporting and separation and filtering within Codeception itself as the runner. And so if you look in this login test, we're essentially performing a set of actions, am on page, fill field, clicking a button, and within that we have these selectors and a URL. So as I said earlier, the URL points to a specific page. And so we have a URL reference, it's wrapped in a double curly brace, which means it's a variable. And within that variable, we point to a page name. And that page name is contained in the file on the left-hand side. And so on the left-hand side, we have a URL specified. And so we just reference that based on the name and then the field name. So we try to keep that as consistent as possible. Again, I know it's something that's kind of foreign, but the more you use it, hopefully the more intuitive it will become to you. That's the way that we've tried to design this. So that's true for the URL, but what about the selectors? How do you actually reference the elements on that page? So once you navigate to the page, you can move to the selector, and we have a section specified. And it's the same section that was specified within the page. And so within that section, you have these different elements declared. And each of those elements has a field, a specific name associated with it, like username, password, login button here, and a selector. And the way that we've done this is that you can change these elements if they change with your test or with your extension or whatever it may be, and your test will automatically get those updates because it's just really pointing to a reference as a variable would in PHP. And so another interesting thing that you can do is that if you declare an element that has a specific weight around it, like a login button, you can declare the weight at the timeout specifically on that button and not worry about during the test flow. All you have to worry about is what you're trying to do, and in terms of driving the browser and driving into a test, you're just worried about a flow of actions. You're not trying to solve inconsistencies within Selenium or within the way Magento is going to respond to your command. Finally, we have data, and so in order to log in as an admin, we need a username and a password, and so we've referenced those things with the user input. The user input references a demo user. That demo user is declared in data, and it's declared by name, the same way all of the other different types of variables are, and it's referenced via its key. So here we have demo user.username, that will get replaced with admin, demo user.password, that will get replaced with password. So trying to keep it as intuitive as possible, and once we actually generate this test, we can actually see that the output should parallel what we've seen on the declaration in XML. So we'll run a robo command that we've provided to generate the test, and it'll go to the same place, a generated folder, and we can kind of look in parity and see that the actions that we've declared in XML are mirrored in the PHP. And so you might be asking, why would you even provide the PHP in the first place if we're writing these things in XML? And a lot of that came from the first point that we talked about earlier, is traceability. So we can run a debugger live against this PHP, and we can see specifically how each of these steps is corresponding to the browser that's being driven. It also gives us specific stack traces and failures that we can point back to a specific PHP file with now that correlates to this XML declaration. And so you'll notice that each of the variables that we pointed to in the XML have been replaced on the PHP side, and we can see kind of a generic test flow that we ordinarily expect for most Selenium tests. And all these actions, again, are very declarative. I am on a page, I'm filling a field, I'm clicking on a button, I'm waiting for a page load, and I'm seeing my element at the very end, my assertion, essentially. And so yeah, so that's essentially the way a test would look, and that's kind of what the test flow we expect, the test flow experience in terms of development. That's what we expect for our users. So I've mentioned a few times mergeability, and why it's important is what I'm going to get to in this next slide. The MFTF XML structure is designed so that it allows for the merging of files across all of those different data containers, essentially, that we've declared in that previous video. So if someone has an extension and they need to merge their changes in, they are not forced to rewrite something. They're not forced to overwrite something. They can add what they need. They can remove more modularly what they need so that they can get their test to pass. Merging is based on a unique ID. That's something that we're trying to come up with a better name with right now. It's merge key, but each of those unique IDs allows us to specify a specific location for the tests. So if you had a certain step that you needed to add before the third step of the test, you could very specifically say, I wanted to add this step before step 3, and we can merge that in order for you and run the test that way. And as I stated earlier, test developers only specify the changes that are required for their test to pass. So the changes can then be just very small files, and they're distributable with the extension. So that way, when people submit extensions to us to run a build, or maybe via an API, they can just give us their Delta files. We can merge them into our tests, and we can run with their extension and with their merged test steps. And several of these Delta files can be applied simultaneously. So this is actually a key point, because a lot of people might ask, well, I can write my test in PHP and still have the same functionality, and that's true with one extension. You can override some test methods, you can override specific classes, But what if you have two extensions and they both touch the same test? Now you have two tests that are overriding the same methods. Which one's the right one? Which one will pass? So that's kind of the question that we asked ourselves when we were writing this framework. And the best way that we could come up with was to use XML, because now we've made it more granular in the sense that we have 10 steps. One extension modifies the first 3, and the second test modifies the last 4. I don't know. But those steps together can essentially give us a successful test flow, whereas a PHP class that's been extended 2 times cannot. And so, although that's not 100% true all the time, you might have extensions that overlap and touch the same set of tests. We've kind of reduced the probability by saying, instead of looking at this from a very overarching and less granular point of view, we've made it more granular and said that specific steps only interact with specific elements, and therefore we can mitigate that risk and say there's a higher probability that these 2 extensions, when they interact, will be able to modify a test in a way that runs successfully. So let's talk a little bit about test execution. And so within that execution, we're using predominantly Robo, and so that's for the benefit of a developer experience. We plan to introduce not only these selection and execution tasks, but we also want to allow you to look at different pieces of your test and provide you some developer tools. And those are coming later. But Robo is essentially going to allow you to have a very natural feeling command line experience, so that you can look at what your tests are doing, what the steps are producing, and even maybe generate some potentially useful templates and utility code for you to use as you're developing. And so Robo is very simple. You just provide it a set of predefined arguments that we've documented in our DevDocs documentation, and essentially they execute behind the scenes, sometimes complex and sometimes relatively lengthy CLI commands or PHP commands, whatever it might be. And so it's just kind of a nice extensible simplification for the developer experience. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot is just traceability. So along that same point, we're going to talk a little bit about logging. So something that Codeception allows is a very specific debug logging. So we can see here that we have a test error that came out. It gave us 401, we don't know why. So we're going to rerun the command with the debug flag. So when we run the command with the debug flag, we get an entire stack trace. We also get all the HTTP output, any network traffic that we see, and we can kind of look and examine this a little more closely. And so if we look at it a little bit more closely, we can look at the message that came back with that 401. So it looks like our account's temporarily disabled. We can also see the request that got executed and the parameters that were used in executing that request. So we can rerun that with a REST client, or we can run it with curl, whatever it might be. And so that gives us the ability then to further understand and determine what's going on. Additionally, we can see specific steps that fail. So we can look at what steps failed, what they were doing, what they were trying to execute, and also the previous steps that succeeded in that test. And again, Codeception's very declarative format allows us to see specifically what each step is doing. So I'm going to a page, I'm filling a field, I'm clicking on an element, I'm waiting for a page load, and I'm asserting on a current URL. So that kind of gives you a little more simplified idea, more readable, behavior specific command that you can look at and analyze for what specifically is going on. Again, reporting in the same vein of traceability is intended to simplify the developer experience. So here we're going to execute a series of tests. We're going to see some failures, and we're going to generate the report. This might be something that you see in the scope of a build. And so we run our robo command to generate the report, and the report opens up, and we can see kind of a breakdown of the tests that were run, the suites that were run, and environment, and those tags that I was talking about earlier pop up here. Those annotations come and get aggregated at this point, and so we can see specifically what each story has in terms of testing around it. So that's at a high level. And so we can go even further, and we can look in and we can see the categories of the tests that got executed as well. So we branch over there, and we can see an aggregation of product defects that we see. So anytime an exception is thrown, anytime an assertion is made that's false, Allure will capture those elements and aggregate them here. So we can immediately see kind of what the hardest hitters are, what the biggest failures are in each of those categories, and drill down based on what we're seeing. And it's a very powerful reporting tool that it's at low cost. And so in terms of test defects as well, we can see things that were executed outside of an assertion and we know aren't related to Magento, but maybe more specifically related to a test. We can also look at a suite level what each of these tests looks like. So we can break down different environments that are running, we can look at the tests that were executed, and we can really dive deep into what specific tests exist around each environment. And so that gives us just another layer that we can look at in terms of reporting. Sorry, I didn't play the video. Okay, there we go. Also, there's a nice charting tool that they use. It just gives you a breakdown. I don't know how many of us will be looking at this. This is definitely more high level stuff, but it's just a nice interface that we can use to look at kind of high level status of the test health. It also gives you stats about duration, so that's something we can track. And this is probably the most interesting thing is we can look at specific test cases and look at the steps within the report. And so within the report, we can see the steps that got executed, and we can look at additionally any failures that persisted as a result of any of the tests that we ran. So here we have a successful test. We can see specifically what ran, which is useful, but more useful than that, we can see the failures. And so we can look at the failures, and we can see a screenshot on the particular step that executed, and we can see that. And we can also see the HTML and render that and look at that more in depth if we want. And we can kind of have an idea of potentially why that test failed, kind of dig around that HTML, look for elements, look for selectors, things like that. So that gives us a lot of different tools and scope to look at when we're trying to debug different test failures. So what's next for us now? We've kind of gotten these features to a point where we're kind of ready to show them to you. Where are we going to go from here? So we're going to look at core framework development. Again, we're not perfect. This framework's not going to solve all the problems in the world, but we think it's at a place where it's usable, and we want to get feedback from you guys. We want to hear the complaints you have with it. We want to make it more usable for our community. We want people to adopt it and use it because we want the Magento code to be quality. We want people to use this framework so that they use Magento. We have a lot of new features that we're developing. Alex and I have been talking, and there's a lot of different feedback that we've gotten. We've made this presentation at Mage Titans this past weekend, and we've gotten good feedback there. So we have a slew of new features that we want to eventually bring into the framework so that it makes the developer's job easier and it makes the framework more robust. Additionally, we're going to be converting test cases so that the coverage itself in MFTF is good, and we can start using some of these tools predominantly when we're evaluating Magento quality. And so that's kind of where we're at right now, but of course we're welcoming feedback, and we want to hear what the experiences are from the people who are using it. And so that's all I have. Do you guys have any questions or comments for me? Yes.
Thank you. This was very useful. And I have a question. You said there is a XML margin in this.
Yes.
And is it possible for external developers to delete some steps? Like, do you have like framework steps? Is it possible to remove them from outside?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, it is possible for people to delete steps that are within the framework. Right now, we don't have a finite solution on how to deal with that. I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but someone could potentially submit a merge step that is just removing all the steps in a test. That's something we've thought about, but we can't take away that flexibility because if someone removes an element, they need a way to remove that step referencing that element. So that's something we thought about. Right now, there's full power for the user. They can submit whatever merge they want, and we'll process it. So they can remove any step that they want and that they choose.
Okay, I also have a question regarding merge keys.
Mhm.
So should they be unique within the test?
Yeah, they only have to be unique within a test.
And what if we have the situation when we need to execute the same step twice within the test?
If you have a need to execute the same step twice within a test, you can just name it with an appended numerator, like 1, 2, whatever it might be.
Okay.
And you can also ideally what we want to see is people who have sets of steps that need to be repeated can use the action groups. And I didn't show that here, but that's going to be something that you can just point in reference to a set of steps and reuse over and over again. That way you don't have to keep referencing the same steps. You know, if you have 5 steps that you need to repeat multiple times within a test, you just specify those once, and then you re-reference them within the test, and that makes it a little bit easier to name them uniquely.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. And also, I've noticed that the selectors are CSS selectors.
Yes.
And does it support XPath?
Yeah, it does support XPath. We prefer CSS for sure, but
Yeah.
but it supports XPath. Yeah, that's definitely supported, and it would go in the same exact field. So you can use either one.
I have one more question.
Keep going.
Okay. Is there a way to interact with a database somehow within the test as a workaround, maybe within API or some direct SQL?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something we thought about a lot. We don't allow that right now. We don't give you the opportunity to use remote database connections. The reason for that is if we want to support the cloud direction that Magento is moving in, we can't always guarantee that someone will give us access to the database. So if we build that type of functionality in and someone wants to run this remotely, it's impossible. So we kind of have to force people to write these tests in a remote way. We're going to open up custom functions eventually, and in a custom function you can do whatever you want. If you want to declare a database connection and inject some SQL and write that, you can do that. But that's not something we're recommending right now. We're trying to support and encourage people to use the API as much as possible, and so far we found that we can do as much of the setup that we need via the API, whether that's disabling the form key like MTF1 did and using those form key based persistence, or the exposed REST APIs that Magento already has. So, short answer is no.
But will it work within REST API?
Yeah, REST API 100% works. Yeah, and we have support for REST API. We also have support for configurations that you make in the backend. Any types of requests, HTTP requests that Magento will make to actually change fields in the database, like PayPal config or Braintree config or something. We support those as well, and it's all the same declaration. So we're going to try to provide as much of the metadata for you. So all you have to do is worry about providing data like the PayPal creds or the customer data, whatever it might be that you want to create.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And the reporting tool is just really cool.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding the reporting tool.
Yes.
In MTF we have an issue. We had an issue when our test documentation weren't synchronized. We keep it in Zephyrs, in Jira, and at the same time we keep it in the test itself. So should we keep our documentation in Zephyrs as it used to be before, or in new tests in MFTA? Where we should keep our test documentation?
I think that's something Alex. Yeah.
I think I can answer this question. Using MFTF, we will keep creating any Zephyr tests.
Okay. So
All documentation will be collected in test itself and using Allure. And there is a functionality called dry run, which will show you all steps which test will run.
in some human readable format.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, and such test documentation can be, such tests in Allure, are they searchable? Or can you show how it looks like?
Do you have another instance?
I don't have one set up right now. We can show it tomorrow.
Yeah, we
can
can
show-
figure it out
we'll
tomorrow.
Have a workshop tomorrow, so we'll show you.
Any other questions?
Okay. Thanks
Okay.
for your time.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. We're going to be doing a walkthrough tomorrow, so if you'd like to walk through through the install of MFTF, these are some of the dependencies. I also made the Slack channel called MFTF Demo Kiev, and I will post a GitHub link to the README with links for all of these dependencies. So if you could just have all of these on your machine tomorrow, it'll make the installation walkthrough a lot easier for everyone. That way, you'll just be able to sail through it. But that's all the information that I have, and thanks for taking the time to listen to us.
All right, thanks, guys.
Actually, no.